gives a hodar to member Barbara Osborn. I think he deserves the title as our chapter's resident president. Last year, Bruce portrayed President James Monroe. This year, he portrays President James Madison. Barbara Osborn takes her place as dutiful wife, Dolly. Please welcome President James Madison and his lovely wife, Dolly Madison.
Well, this won't be terribly authentic. Last year, James Monroe was 6'2". It's James Madison. I'm 5'4" and never quite weighed 100 pounds. So I should do this on my knees.
Is this the one that works? Is this the one? Oh, excellent.
Take hold for it.
That's really good. Okay. Hold the mic. Well, we can just. So, welcome. And James and I are going to be sharing our family album with you. Can you all see? Is this in the way?
No, you are.
Thank you, Polly.
It's a lovely view.
Okay, so, is this better? Okay.
Yay.
Okay. So, this is our family album, and it's a little.
That's
There. Okay. I should have made the font larger. Sorry. So, James, tell us about your wonderful family home in Bell Grove.
Well, first of all, we'll ask your indulgence. Because when we did presentations, when Dolly and I were first married, of course, there were magic lanterns with a bed sheet and a candle and silhouettes. So this newfangled stuff is new to us, and you'll have to indulge us on this as well. So I was born in 1751 in Virginia. The first 4 U.S. presidents were all Virginians of Virginia. And this is the home where I was born. In 1760, then, my family moved to the family estate, and right down the road from Thomas Jefferson, a good friend. My family was pretty successful tobacco planters back then. Can you hear?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay. Our family plantation had about 5,000 acres. We had 100 slaves back then. And just like so many of the other signers of and early founding fathers, one of our challenges was, how do you reconcile having slaves when you're talking about the emancipation of your country and delivering the freedom to this new country, trying to separate from the colonial powers. This is the family plantation that we moved to in 1760, Mount Pleasant Plantation, the family home, now a state park.
Now, James Madison was part of the Virginia group, the Old Dominion at Jefferson, Madison, Monroe. They were all buddies.
Okay, so the house itself is called Montpelier. It's still standing. It's an elegant Georgian-style home back then in 1760, which is where we spent the rest of our lives. Dolly and I, after serving in Washington, D.C., we moved back here until our respective deaths. I attended the University of New Jersey, or the College of New Jersey, which is today's Princeton College. The program back then for your baccalaureate was 3 years. I finished in 2 years, and this is kind of representative of the rest of my life. I was known for being an ardent, enthusiastic student, usually in any group, the most well-prepared. At the Continental Congress, I was the first arrival, always there. Took notes, and was known for my earnest behavior. You'll notice in the paintings, you'll never see James Madison with a smile. I think he was compensating for his diminutive stature, and he had a rather sickly constitution.
Oh, and here's one of your best friends, William Bradford, and later he became Attorney General. And then you finished in 2 years. Normally it's a 3-year program. But he was actually raised Episcopal and was even talking about going into the ministry. But he was so influenced by John Witherspoon, the president of Princeton, who was very influenced by the Age of Enlightenment thinkers, that James became a deist, like Benjamin Franklin. And of course, this was the time when King George III was giving us grief. So, even here we were wealthy, he was a wealthy Virginia planter. They were not happy with what was going on with England trying to tax them just to pay for ruling them.
Here it is. You'll see the pictures. It was a very small man, as it was. Sure. Like I said, the bed sheet and the candle never gave us these difficulties. I'm just fascinated to see, because we think of most of our founding fathers, most of our founding fathers are very tall, statuesque people. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin was quite the ladies' man, but he wasn't quite that ilk. Madison was the exception for all these early folks. And yet, despite his diminutive stature and poor health, was a giant in the early founding fathers and the things that he accomplished for the early nation.
And one of the reasons he went to Princeton, everybody was going to William and Mary at the time in Virginia, and he did not want to go down there because he was worried about his health, and being down in the Low Country, he was worried about malaria. So that's one of the major reasons he went to Princeton, because he did not want to be down in the South. Now,
So-
yeah, talk about your
So after graduating from Princeton, in the College of New Jersey, I was early elected to Virginia Council of State. I became a close ally of Thomas Jefferson, and for the rest of our lives, our respective lives, we were both very close personal friends and very close partners in the founding of the new country and in the early government as well. So of course, we're familiar with this document, 1776, which is just the beginning. And it's interesting, as we prepared for this, to remind ourselves just how much work there was to do to form an entirely new country out of whole cloth in the middle of a war across the Atlantic. The challenges that had to be overcome were significant. So it's common to think that the Declaration of Independence was signed and that was it, we're done. Instead, that was just the very beginning of many, many long years, many long days with the founding fathers to work out the particulars of this new country. This is just one of the common paintings. After the war ended in 1783, now you have a new country, these United States. The Articles of Confederation were sort of the first document, instead of the Constitution, to define the nature of this new country, how its government was going to be run, that it had significant shortcomings, and it was really just sort of a first draft of history of the new nation as well. Read the observations here. It says that the articles were too weak. There were too many things that were left undefined for the powers of the new country. They had no power to raise revenue, no power for taxation. As well, there were some things that weren't defined as far as the relationship of the government to the individual citizens, and those later became the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution.
And James Madison also knew that they wanted Western expansion, and there was no accounting for that in the Articles of Confederation. He was a Virginian, so he was mainly states' rights. But what happened was, the more he got into it, he realized they needed a stronger federal government. So these Articles of Confederation, the states were just a loose confederacy. There wasn't anything really binding them together.
Even though we're the largest state as Virginia, we knew that these colonies wouldn't be the only part that the new nation had. In fact, there'd be more expansion, probably westward. And so what this did was allow us to incorporate both new states, new populations, how do you accommodate those instead of just the original 13 colonies that were part of the Declaration of Independence.
Talk about your buddies.
Yeah, it was a remarkable time when you think about it, especially in this time.
Sorry, James.
Yeah, the magic lantern, there we are, changing the bed sheets. Okay, go back.
There it is.
And
Sorry,
here we are.
Jim.
Just what a remarkable collaboration of giants there were at this time. And the very first, in fact, during the quiz this morning, it was said that the only president who didn't run on a political party was George Washington, the original giant of the country. And after that, then you have the parties divide really along the lines of the Democrat Republicans, who were the states' rights advocates to have the states hold the primary power, and then the second was the Federalists, and I and Jefferson were the Federalists, along with others. Part of our Virginia delegation here was Randolph and George Mason. As we're trying to define the nature of the government for this new country, you had large states, large populations, small populations. How do you accommodate all these conflicting wishes? And of course, nobody was shy. You had very strong advocates for two different sorts of ways to represent these. You have the New Jersey plan, and that was fostered by folks who had said we should have a single branch of government, a unicameral Congress, and a strong executive. And then on the Federalist side, we fostered what we call the Virginia plan. And that said we should have a bicameral Congress, the House of Representatives, based on population. Then we should also have a Senate where every state had equal representation. And that's what we have today, the 2 senators. And then having a second branch being the judiciary. And then third and finally was a strong executive power. And in fact, of course, the Virginia plan is the one that became the foundation for our Constitution that we still have today. It's interesting. I wish I could have seen a picture of these two guys together. It'd be sort of like they would have been a great comedy team. You got George Washington up here, and then down here, almost like his ventriloquist midget, was James Madison. And yet the two were very close friends. They were personal friends. They were strong confidants. And George Washington relied on James Madison then for much of the groundwork. In fact, I was listening to a talk recently, and it said that for his inaugural address, George Washington was way too busy, both to travel, because it was all done by horseback, to write his own inaugural address. And so he asked his personal secretary to write his inaugural address. He got 78 pages back, and he said, here it is. And he looked at it, and Washington said, this will never do. And he said, James, and handed it to Madison and said, here, can you redo this? And he got a much abbreviated and much more popular inaugural address from a very grateful audience, I'm sure, that first day.
So this Virginia plan, or the new Constitution, Washington approved of it, Benjamin Franklin approved of it, so it was off to a good start. James Madison, in producing this new Constitution, read 400 books, many of them. He was very affected by David Hume, the Scottish Enlightenment philosopher, and Adam Smith, the Scottish economist, Scotland. And so he and James Madison and John Jay got together, and the Federalist Papers were basically ammunition for people to read, and they were for the pro-ratification of this new Constitution. So you had a lot of people getting together, and there was different sides. So the side for pro-ratification, all these essays were called the Federalist Papers.
Of the Federalist Papers, there are 2 volumes that were published, 85 essays. Of those 85 essays, I wrote 29 of them. And what it does is give you pause to think, one can imagine 200 years down the road, perhaps we have little entertainment devices or little things that, well, could waste your time. Instead of wasting your time looking at cat videos or things like that, but people were able to just, how do they spend their time? Reading and studying. And so this is a man who read over 400 books, as Dolly was saying, prior to writing the Federalist Papers, which initiated then the call for the Constitution in this whole country. It's just amazing when one thinks probably how much brain power is being wasted today. This is a little kind of a commercial observation here. Just It's just amazing, these people. So this 5'4" giant who created so much of this. Well, the Constitution itself was drafted and then ratified 12 years after the Declaration of Independence. So 12 years, or 5 years after victory at Yorktown, and the new country was a new country. But it was a new country with effectively an impotent governing document, which was the Confederation.
So James Madison was up in Philadelphia and was working with Washington, and he really didn't hold a political seat, but he ran against Monroe for the Virginia congressional seat, and he won. And there was some bad blood between them when they were doing the campaigning, but as you'll see later, they patched it up.
Well, Monroe and I, we were both friends, cordial, and we were neighbors in Virginia plantations. We had a little bit of hard blood when we both vied for the same congressional seat. We later mended our ways and became very close friends, especially during both of our respective presidencies. Well, the Bill of Rights. So we drafted the Constitution, brought this out, addressed the form of the government, addressed the concerns of both the small states and the larger states, the industrial states, and the farming states, because Jefferson had really thought that this country was going to be largely based on an agricultural economy. And there were those of us who said, no, trade is going to be paramount as far as providing the future for the country, both its welfare and its well-being. Even after drafting the Constitution, it just says that again. That was probably the second draft of history. And then we started amending it. So you've got a perfect document, and it reminds me of the old expression, when somebody is getting married, they said, I love you, you're perfect, now change. That was the same with the Constitution here. So we had the Constitution drafted. Before you know it, you had 10 amendments. So those first 10 amendments, of course, are the Bill of Rights. And they were ratified in 1789. Interestingly, I was not an original advocate or fan of these 10 amendments or this Bill of Rights. Later, I came to see the errors of my way and realized that these actually provided significant protections for the citizens in this new country, because we're crafting both a new republic, a new democracy, something that hadn't been done imperfectly since the Romans and the Greeks, and trying to create it here.
So in 1792, James Madison came up to Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention. And about the same time in Philadelphia, I was raised Quaker. And my father was from the South, and he had slaves, and his conscience was pricked, so he sold all of his slaves. And ever since then, his fortunes just went down, 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 down. And he had some nefarious dealings, and the Quakers kicked him out. So we moved up to Philadelphia, and as a result, I was pressured to marry this Quaker lawyer called John Todd, and we had 2 children. Now, unfortunately, a couple years later, the yellow fever came through Philadelphia, and I lost my husband, my son William, my mother-in-law and father-in-law, and only I and my son John Payne, who we called Payne, survived. So my mom opened a boarding house, and she was known for her lovely social graces and hostessing. And we lived in the boarding house, obviously, and also a gentleman named Aaron Burr lived in there. So Madison and Aaron Burr were very, very good friends, and asked Aaron Burr to introduce us. Now, because I was a widow, and I was quite good looking at the time, I would literally have gentlemen callers sitting outside my front door waiting for me to come out. So, I met James, and he was quite a bit older than me. And because he was up and coming, we were kind of like the power couple. So we kind of we
we snuck away and got married in Harewood, Virginia, at a friend's house, and then you adopted our son, Payne.
So Dolly and I were never blessed with children of our own, so I adopted her son. He became my stepson. And he became, whoops, his name was Payne. I was not sure what we're doing here.
The bottom keeps falling off.
So, in 1797, it says, after 7 years in Congress, then we moved back to the family home in Montpelier. When Thomas Jefferson then became president, of course, Washington, Adams, when Tom Jefferson then, my neighbor, became president, he asked me to be his Secretary of State. In 1802, in fact, we were talking here earlier, which president signed the Constitution. Jefferson was off in France. He'd been dispatched there to negotiate the purchase, starting with New Orleans. Well, this is like one of those family affairs when I'm going out, honey, to look at a house, and you come back having bought a farm, or looking to buy, maybe a bicycle, and you come back with a fancy sports car. Well, he went off to buy New Orleans and came back with half the country.
And also, Napoleon was so desperate for money because he'd been through all these wars and the war, in Russia, and he really didn't want this land, this Louisiana Purchase land anymore. He'd rather have the money. So here he was in France and was given this deal, and he accepted it. Well, when he came back, Madison was saying, hey, this is not constitutional. You can't just, laterally buy this land without consulting Congress. But he did, so he was forgiven when he came back. And there it is. 15 million. Now, when Jefferson was president, he was a widower. So I would help him with his hostessing duties. And my best friend in Philadelphia's husband was an architect, Benjamin Henry Latrobe. And so he and I worked on fixing up the White House because Jefferson didn't care. It was just very bare. And then when he went back to Monticello, he took his things with him. So it was very bare. So we worked on it together. His wife was in Philadelphia still, so she would help me shop for china and the silverware. So he became president, or president.
So, right, so after Jefferson, I served as the Secretary of State, which is when Dolly really became Jefferson's sort of office wife. The two of them worked closely together, and she was really, Dolly was everything I wasn't. I was shy, retiring, sort of taciturn. Dolly was sunshine, brightness, the soul of society there, as well as being quite a babe. So Jefferson appreciated her, and I like to think that was training to help run my White House then.
And also, Abigail Adams, who had never met me, was critical of me because I wore French fashions, the empire dressing, and I even put a little rouge on. So Abigail Adams was very critical of me, even though I had never met her. And here we were, Wednesday nights. Okay, so if you remember, Washington and Adams and Jefferson were so, it was such a reaction against the monarchy in London that they had very plain administrations, no social events, and of course the White House during Adams was still being built, so there wasn't much going on there. So when I came in, and after having decorated it with Latrobe, I had this sumptuous mansion. Well, I didn't mind holding court. So I would have Wednesday nights salons, and I wore my tiaras and my turbans and my feathers, and Washington, Adams, and Jefferson were very careful not to show patronage. Well, that's my middle name. If someone needed something, some help from someone in their family, they would come to me, and I would write letters, or I'd drop a nice little line in someone's ear at my salons. And that's how things got done in Washington, because the men didn't get anything done. So this is where the real power was. And I didn't mind wearing my tiaras.
Like they used to refer to Dolly as the first lobbyist. One of the complaints was in the Washington society of the time, is all the men did was get together and talk politics from yes, Mary. From morning till night, all they did was get together and talk politics. After Dolly and I came to DC, Dolly changed that, and she had the Wednesday evening soirees, which were a big social event, popular. I like to think that she was the soft power at the White House. I tried to use logic and reason. She used glamour, glitz, and charm.
Can you believe it? Somebody even called me Queen Dolly Lolly.
Queen Dolly Lolly.
Queen Dolly Lolly. Yes, yes. And then, well, you all know about 1812, right? Many of you are in the Warhawks, 1812. So, you know, in 1814, I won't go into all the details, but the British came up and came into Washington, and Madison was off with his men. He didn't flee, like some people accused him of. He was with his men and his armies overlooking the city, and he told me to leave, and I said, yeah. Well, I said, I'm gonna set the place. I'm gonna serve, when you guys are finished, come back and we'll have a big dinner. So I set my banquet table for 40 people. I put out my best china and my best crystal, and I had the wines chilling on the sideboard, and the meat was ready. And wouldn't you know it, we got sacked. Sound familiar? Anyway, so they were coming, and I got messages from him to run, to get away. So I grabbed important papers, I grabbed silver, I grabbed, I said, what do I do? The Gilbert Stuart painting, what do I do? So, of course, it was screwed to the wall or nailed to the wall, and we couldn't get it out, so I said, break the frame. So they broke the frame, and they got it off the frame, and then they rolled it up, and I gave it to two gentlemen who took it away for safety. And so then we just fled in the nick of time. And those British came, sat down, and ate my food, and drank my wine, and then burned my beautifully decorated executive mansion. So after the executive mansion was burned, when we came back, we lived in this octagonal house for 6 months while we were restoring the executive. And this shows the burn marks. So what I did was, because we didn't have sandblasting back then, I painted the White House, the executive mansion, white. So from then on, we called it the White House.
I preferred blue, but I was outvoted. I like that for you.
So this was me in my last year as First Lady. Obviously, I've aged some. And then we retired to Montpelier. And this isn't artificially photoshopped. This was me. This was actually me standing next to my niece, and someone had cut out the niece and put James Madison in. He was actually dead when I was in 18.
It's not a very ugly piece.
No. So what I did was, we went back to Montpelier, and when he died, I went back up to Washington. And unfortunately, and all those years of living in Montpelier, I did not mind having slaves, because I saw what happened to my father after he sold his slaves. So I wanted to be back. I hated being poor, so I wanted to be back up in the top echelon of society. And if it meant having slaves, then I had slaves. And what happened was, as my life went on, my son Payne, who was left in charge of the plantation, unfortunately took to drink, and ran the plantation into the ground. So unfortunately, near the end of my life, I had no money. And all my loyal friends from when I was First Lady came to my rescue, bought me food, paid my rent, and basically, I even tried selling some of my husband's papers, but he wasn't as popular as he once was. So unfortunately, toward the end of my life, I was in poverty, but I had really good friends. And this is an actual picture of me when I was aged 81. The daguerreotype. Oh, is that the one by Matthew Brady? No. This is the one by Matthew Brady, the Civil War daguerreotype. And here I am, and I died shortly after this. So that is our family album.